Hey everybody, welcome to Conscientious Omnivore. My name is Paola. Today I'm going to be talking about some topics that I think are very interesting and relevant. I hope you enjoy them. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the ethics of veganism, and also going to bring in the kind of like environmental aspect and what we can do to basically make the world a little bit of a better place. And I'm going to tie it together with the holiday that is going on right now, which is basically Halloween leading into All Saints Day, which you may or may not celebrate in your area of the world. But here in Europe, it's kind of like a big holiday, and I want to talk about that. And hopefully this topic is interesting to you. So let's get into it. So the holiday that I want to talk about is All Saints Day. And basically, it's the day after Halloween. Most people are probably more familiar with that holiday. But All Saints Day is also known as All Hallows Day. It's basically a day to celebrate the various saints through Christian history. And a lot of people here in Hungary especially, but I think through much of the Western world, take that day as a day to go to cemeteries, remember your loved ones, and also, of course, pay homage to the saints throughout the years. So it's a very nice time, I think, to reflect on kind of your mortality and go to the cemetery and pay your respects and things like that. So the reason I was kind of interested in looking at this was there's a lot of different people where when you talk to them about veganism, they'll often go to certain passages in the Bible or some type of religious teaching or some kind of scripture where they try to make it seem like it's an inappropriate diet, and that somehow we are meant to be eating meat, and that the Bible and especially Christian religion almost like mandates it or dictates it that you should be eating animals. And I want to challenge that and show you some examples that I've found throughout many centuries that show quite the opposite. So a little bit I just wanted to mention that Christian vegetarianism, especially, so it's not exactly veganism, but vegetarianism has roots going back to the very beginnings of the Christian faith. So there's a lot of evidence to show that early Christians were largely vegetarian or even mostly vegetarian. There's various kind of efforts, even kind of like the year 400-ish and whatever, where there were a lot of people still kind of using vegetarian diets as part of like the religious life that they were leading. And much later on, of course, there were also many offshoots of Christianity and different kinds of churches that were set up by different kinds of people, and many of these movements also had vegetarianism in their basic like principles that they were based on and following. So there's some examples here that Bible Christian Church was founded by Reverend William Cowherd in 1809. They followed a vegetarian diet. They were one of the philosophical forerunners of the Vegetarian Society. So the Seventh-day Adventists also largely follow a vegetarian diet. The Mormons have some aspects of vegetarianism. There's different references here about Quakers and other kind of religious orders. And then some really old Roman Catholic monastic orders as well had strict vegetarian diets. So you can see that the Carthusians and Cistercians, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but these are orders that were founded in the towards the end of the 11th century, and they also followed vegetarian diets. So you can see that these were founded quite some time ago, and they lived very simple lives. These monks were often kind of somewhat removed from society. They lived very sparse lives. Basically, one of their things was like a vow of poverty, and they lived a very simple life, and they followed a simple diet as well. and specifically in relation to kind of saints. When you do a little bit of reading about Saint Francis of Assisi, he's one of the kind of more interesting saints that I found, where he's the patron saint of animals, and there are a lot of things that throughout his life there were lots of stories about how he was always very kind to animals, and wanted people to treat them well. So there's a nice little quote here. He believed that nature itself was the mirror of God. He called all creatures his brothers and sisters, and even preached to the birds. There's wonderful stories about how he interacted with animals, and basically just really looked upon all of nature and God's creation as something to be in awe of and respect and be kind to. So I think that was very interesting. And then what I think is probably one of the favorite things I've found recently is Saint Francis of Paola, and he was also a kind of a hermetic monk. So he was off living in a cave early on, and then he kind of ended up founding a religious order. They were called the Order of Minims, and they followed basically a vegan diet. So he abstained from all animal products, and lived to be quite an old man. I think he was 91 when he died, which for at the time, that's pretty uncommon, I would say, at the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century. And there's a lot of incredible stories and legends, or miracles, or whatever you want to call them, associated with him. And they involve all sorts of kind of pretty beautiful things that he's done for animals, and taking care of them. So there's stories about how he really truly loved all the animals that lived around him, and he gave them names, and he knew them by name, and he had some pretty incredible things associated with him. So I would definitely recommend anybody who's interested in veganism in the slightest to go check out Saint Francis of Paola. It's a very interesting story. Read quite a little bit about him, and I think there's some really interesting stories. So the thing that kind of I wanted to bring this whole conversation back to is kind of today's day and age. Like what does this all mean in our world that we live in now? And one thing that's a little bit more modern, I wanted to bring up a few quotes from the current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, which is Pope Francis. He had some, pretty interesting things to say in the recent past. I think some of these quotes were from probably 2015, I think, so maybe like 2 years ago. But I really liked this one. It said, "We have only one heart, and the same wretchedness that which leads us to mistreat an animal will not be long in showing itself in our relationships with other people. Every act of cruelty towards any creature is contrary to human dignity." So I think those are pretty strong words, and for anybody who is, religious or Catholic especially, they should really consider the deep meaning of what he's saying here. He's saying that basically by being cruel to animals, it's really like one and the same. It's the same path that is going to lead you to being cruel to people. So you're cruel to animals, you're going to be cruel to people, and he really says that it's contrary to human dignity. So I think that's an important quote, and has a lot of power. And then the next one that I wanted to read is just this one. It says, "Today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor." This, I think, really says a lot, again, on a lot of different levels. One is that, you basically have the environment being impacted so heavily by animal agriculture that it's, as a religious person, as a caring person, you simply cannot ignore that. We cannot destroy the world that that we have to live on simply for our taste pleasures. And basically the fact that he's also bringing it back to the cry of the poor also, I think, in my mind, says that he's aware of the connection that poor people are often the people who suffer the most from the agricultural practices that we have in the modern world. So you have people being displaced in the Amazon. The forests are getting cut down. You have the basically the soy and the corn that's being produced in these areas being fed to livestock, which is then shipped all over the world to feed rich people living in the developed areas of the world. And it really is a social justice movement for people as well, to consider the impact of what you're eating. So I think these are like really important messages, and especially just from an ethical, moral standpoint, I think people really need to consider more their impact of choosing what to eat. As I've said in some of my other videos, I really truly believe that you can be really healthy, and in fact quite healthier on a healthy vegan, whole food, plant-based diet. And that's my experience for sure. I feel healthier and better than I ever have, and I really recommend, if anybody hasn't watched any of those videos, I'll link some here at the end, and please do check those out. But yeah, just to kind of sum up, I think there's another interesting thing that I just want to end on is forest gardening. This is a term that was coined in the 1980s by a man called Robert Hart, and basically a lot of these ideas for his garden were based on kind of the idea that the Garden of Eden was a vegan paradise. So back in the creation stories in the Bible, you read that basically God created the Garden of Eden, and he gave Adam and Eve every plant and seed and fruit-bearing tree as their sustenance. So the idea that right from the beginning man was meant to eat a vegan diet is right there in the Bible. And Robert Hart was actually an interesting person, and he developed his gardening after World War II to basically create kind of a respite for himself and his brother, who had some I think he had some pretty severe handicaps, if I remember right. And that was some place that he wanted them to be able to go and relax and just be in nature. And he had a small plot of land, and he very quickly realized that the most efficient use of that land was going to be growing a mixture of fruit trees and bushes and some kind of smaller things low to the ground, and vines and things like that. And he came up with a really clever design that allowed him to kind of have a mix of plants. So you can see here it's like a tiered system, and you have your canopy layer, your lower tree layer, and et cetera, and you go down, and then you basically have your ground cover and the vines. And really interesting because it allows you to grow a lot of food in a very small space. And these ideas have actually been taken and even expanded a lot more in more recent times. And actually you can see here that Bill Mollison, who coined the term permaculture, you've heard me talk about that a few times probably, and if you've watched my previous videos, he kind of visited Robert Hart back in 1990, and I think he took a lot of that methodology and then expanded that, and that has really kind of gone through all of permaculture. So it's really interesting that even for anybody who's gardening and wanting to grow their own food, there's a lot of kind of history tying back to these you can almost say like religious roots, and very fascinating stuff. I actually want to get the book that Robert Hart wrote. I haven't had a chance to pick that up yet, but I definitely want to get that, and if I do, I'll share my thoughts on that. But yeah, just I just wanted to share this with you. I hope you find it interesting. And I'll put some links, in the description field, so you can do some more reading yourself on these topics. And yeah, I just wanted to say, happy Halloween to everybody, and happy All Saints Day. And yeah, take a look at some of these pretty inspiring people, and some of the things that they achieved. And yeah, if you're into gardening, check out Robert Hart. Talks a lot about kind of, how you can make a lot of, produce come out of a small piece of land using veganic agriculture. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please remember to subscribe and share this video with a friend. And yeah, I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.